Hi everyone! In this tutorial we will explain how to create complex windows such as info windows or purchase windows, which can have a combination of different elements including images, text, buttons like purchase buttons, etc. For example, we will try and create a typical purchase window in this tutorial, which will pop up when clicking on this piece of art here. So this window has an image, a text, and a purchase button, which will take us to an external web from where I can purchase this piece of art, and an X button to close the window. The advantage of the way that we will create this window in this tutorial with all of its elements inside is that the combination of elements in this window will always show properly, no matter the resolution of the screen. So independently of whether the tool is seen on a computer or on a smartphone, you can be sure that your audience will always see the window exactly as you designed it, as the individual elements inside it will resize dynamically so as to maintain the overall design of the window. So there will be absolutely no problems with rescaling the window and elements shifting over each other or anything like that. As you can see, when I resize the browser window, all of the elements resize proportionally to maintain the overall design. Before diving right into the program and creating the window, I will show you a scheme or a hierarchy of how the purchase window will be set up, so that later when I create the window inside the program, you understand the steps and the structure. First, we will create one big container, which will be as big as the screen and which will serve as a background to the actual window which we will create. So it'll be like a veil to darken the screen and hence the panorama behind the window. In there, we insert a second container, which is kind of the main container that'll contain the actual content of the window. And inside of this main container, we will create a third container, which will serve as a header to put the closing X, for example. And at the same level, so still inside the main container, so the second one, we will insert a fourth container, which will actually carry the content elements. This fourth container we will also further split into another two containers. On the left we will insert a container which will carry the image, and on the right we will insert a container in which we will then insert the text image as well as the purchase button. These two need to be individual elements so that the button can actually be an active area. In my case, I will use an image for the text here, so what I did is I created this text element outside of the program in another design program, which allows me to create more complex designs, and then insert it here as an image, which is something you cannot tell in the end, but which makes things quite a bit easier. But instead of inserting the text as image, you can also just use the text element in VT Pro and simply write the text in here if you don't want to use another external program to write the text part. So both is possible. Now let's start inside the program. We said we'd create one first container which would cover 100% of the screen. The easiest way to do this is to set the position to 0 in every respect. Let's change the background color to black to make the veil a little darker so that the window later steps out more. And we'll call this first container 1. This will help with the orientation later. Alright, now on to the second container, which is, like we said before, going to be the most important container as it will contain the content, so it will be the actual window, and we'll call that container 2. In order to make sure that this container also always resizes with the screen, we will define it like we did with the container before. So we set the position on all of the 4 directions, but instead of 0 we set these values to 12, for example, to make it smaller than the first container. Why smaller? Well, because now each of the edges are positioned at 12% rather than at 0%. So 0% would be the actual edge of the screen, 12% is a little farther to the middle. Now you might be wondering why I am defining the container size using these position controls rather than the actual size settings up here. This is because the position controls have one big advantage. Apart from the fact that by defining the position of 4 edges, I by definition also define the size of the container, this also makes sure that no matter how big or small the screen is, the purchase window will always be centered because it is forced to maintain these margins of 12 on each side. In contrast, if I used the size control, I'd still have to define the position of the container with 2 of the sides down here. These 2 sides would maintain fixed margins, while the other 2 side margins would adapt because I had fixed the size of the container. Therefore, the container would not be centered when resizing the overall screen. Keep in mind that when I define both left and right position, I cannot define the horizontal size here anymore. It's ghosted because this is already defined by the position of the left and right edge of the container. If I deactivate one of these edges, I can obviously define the horizontal size again. So it's either one or the other. The next step is to create the third container, which we will call header, which is the one that we will then place the closing X button in. We need this to be an extra container for the X button not to shift around or decentralize upon resizing the overall window. Select container again and drop it inside the second container, so it is linked to the second container and acts as a child container of the second container. Drag and drop it to be 100% wide, and the vertical size we'll set it to 15%. And we call this container 3Header. Inside of this third container, we will place the X button. So we select button, now we could select one of the buttons here or go to new and import a button that we have stored outside of the program on our computer, which is what we're going to do. And in case you don't know this yet, here's a useful little trick in general. If you want to create a button with different states, just select the button images with the button designs at the same time and click open. Then click to place the button inside the third container. And now if you go to edit style, we see that the button already understood that one of the 3 possible states should be the second image we imported. Now we can just drag this over to make the button change on rollover already. Okay, so the button is not centered yet. In order to center it, we select the container that it is inside, which is its parent. That is container 3Header. We set the layout to be horizontal. Okay, the button jumped to the left, but we want it to be on the right actually. So we open horizontal alignment and change it to right. And in vertical alignment, we set it to be in the middle. And because now the button literally sticks to the right corner, we give it a little bit of padding on the right so the whole thing can breathe a little bit. Now we set the button right where we want it, but it would not know what to do when being clicked, so we need to determine the action of the button still. When using buttons that have transparency, like our X here, it is absolutely crucial to tick this box right here, which will make the transparent parts of the button act as the actual button. Otherwise, your audience will have to click right on the black line of the X in order to close the window, which can be quite hard. So that way, no matter where on the button square they actually click, the window will close. Now click Add Action, select Show Hide Component, and we'll select that the button should hide container 1, which container 1 being parent to all other containers will automatically close all of the rest of the containers then too, because the rest of the containers are the child containers of container 1. Next, we create the container that'll go below the header container, in which will have all the actual content and text and all. This one will also be a child container of container 2 and therefore be linked to it. So we drop this new container inside of container 2 below the header, call it for content, and we'll make it 100% wide and 85% tall. Since the header was 15%, we have 85% left inside the parent container to fill it completely. Now we do have this scroll bar here, which we do not want, so we have to go back to that level, which is the parent container, so container 2. and we'll set the layout from absolute to vertical and decrease the gap to close the gap between container 3 and 4, which caused the scroll bar in the first place, because we technically had more than 100% of container 2 used. So we had 15% filled with container 3 header, 85% filled with container 4, which already makes up 100%. Plus, then on top of that, we also had the gap between the two containers. So that is what we needed to take away in order to make the scroll bar disappear. Now we still need to divide our container 4 into 2 more containers, one on the left with the actual image of the painting, and one on the right for the description and button and all of that. So we place the left container inside of container 4 content and call it container 4 left. And let's make it 65% wide, which is more or less what I calculated that the image will need. And then we just insert the right container, set it to be 35%, so the remaining part of the width of the parent container, and we call it 4 right. Now I do want to change one value of their parent container still, so I go back to selecting container 4 content and change its layout from absolute to horizontal, because the two containers that I just dropped in there should be aligned exactly horizontally rather than in absolute terms of where I physically dropped them. So to make them symmetric, I align the content inside of container 4 content in the center and on the top. So container 4 left and right will always stick to the top of container 4 content, and if there's ever any extra space inside of container 4 content, it'll be on the bottom of that, just because it looks better. Okay, back to container 4 left, we insert the image now, so click image and select the file in the browser. And in order to align it on the top right, we need to select its parent container and check alignment. Set it to vertical. So we set this to right and top. And now we have the image where we wanted it. Same thing for the right container. Like I said before, this is an image of a text element which I created outside in an editing program, but instead of doing it like this, you can select the text element instead of inserting an image, and then create a text element and type in the text or edit it right here without using an external program at all. Again, let's align it to the top left, therefore select its parent container. Check layout to be vertical, because in this case we will insert a second element, the button, below this text image here. So container 4 right should contain its elements in a vertical layout. And this is already as we wanted on the left and on the top, so that's all good. Below the text image we now insert the purchase button. So in the skin elements we select icon button and go to new to import our own button design, just like we did before with the closing X button. And in the same way, we select both images. Or you know what? Let's now do it the other way so you see the old school alternative too. So we select just one of the two designs, place the button, and then in Edit Style, we click on the 3 little dots in the button state in which we want to change the design, and then select the other image. So now we have the normal design and the rollover design. And as you can see, the button automatically already sticks to the left side, because before we selected the container 4 right and set all of its content to align to the left. So the button automatically does that too. Good, that's the basic content part done. Now we can fine-tune the spaces between these elements. For example, in the content container, we can see that these two elements are quite close to each other, so we should increase this gap right here. Therefore, we increase the gap here on the right, which is the gap between the horizontally laid out elements that container 4 content contains. So the gap between 4 left and 4 right. Now we'll do the same thing inside of container 4 right, so between the text image and the purchase button. Let's set this to 55. This way it is more or less aligned. Alright, now that we have the layout of the window more or less ready, the moment has come to make container 2 totally and uniformly white, because right now you can still see the individual containers inside of it. So we click on container 2 and we go to Edit Styles. Now white is already selected, but let's take this control to 100 to make the container entirely opaque. And there we go. This is the final window design and how I wanted it to look. I recommend working like this. So for constructing a window like this, try working with several levels of containers, because this will allow you to keep elements well aligned even when the browser window gets minimized. If we had just put all of the elements, so the closing button, the image, the text and the purchase button, directly into container 2 right away, they would almost certainly start overlapping or shifting around when the window size would change. Be mindful that when changing a value of one of the components, this might affect the other components, because in the end they are all interrelated. So if I change the size of container 2 now, this will affect the size of all other containers inside it, because we are working with scales and percentages rather than pixels. So just bear that in mind and always check in the preview after tweaking things. Okay, so let's have a look what our window looks like in the browser. The window looks good, but let's see how it behaves when we start resizing the browser window. Okay, the individual elements here adapt as we wanted them, but here's still a little glitch, because this right here should always be aligned or at the same height of the content of the text image to the right here. But these are errors which we'll fix right now. So the reason that this is not completely aligned is that this image, even though we set the container to align its content on the top right, the image itself we also have to set to align on the top right. Okay, and the same for the text image component. Select it and set it to align to the left and to the top. And the same also for the button, left and top. And let's check it. Creating complex windows is always a process of changing and checking, until you're happy with how you see your window in the preview browser, so here. Alright. See how the text and the top of the image are now always aligned? Still we see that every component adapts in size apart from the close button and the buy button, which is something we should fix. So they don't adapt in size because their size is defined in pixels, so in absolute terms, when really we should have them in percentage, so they resize together with the rest of the elements. However, we should have in mind that when we make the screen really small, you would hardly see the closing button anymore, let alone be able to actually click it. So we should set a minimum value in absolute terms that won't allow the button to get smaller than, say, 20 pixels. Same for the buy button. Just change it to percentage without touching the values, they'll translate automatically. It's also a good idea to save your work from time to time and then go back and preview. Okay, now everything is proportionally right, even when we simulate different screen sizes. Still, for my taste, the left and the right sides of frames are a little bit too wide. And in fact, when you go back to the program, you will see that the proportions look better inside the program, where these frames are slightly smaller. Why is that? That's because we're designing the elements on top of this area, while the browser window later has a surface area that goes all the way to here. Therefore, it'll never look exactly the way we designed it here. So you have to trust the values you set and then check and correct using the actual preview. To correct the big frames, let's try and change the position of the overall content container to 16 and 16, for example. And you see that while we see it a teeny bit crowded here when we click on preview and see it inside the actual browser, which does not have all of this part here and is therefore quite a bit wider, it looks perfect. And everything's still behaving correctly. Good. Okay, so now we have proven that our window behaves correctly in any situation on a PC or Mac, but we do recommend dedicating some attention to mobile designs in particular, since our virtual tours are compatible with all devices, PCs, Macs, tablets, smartphones. So you should make sure that your tours are visualized exactly the way you want it, no matter the device. With some minor adjustments and without losing the original design we already created for PCs, we can make that same window behave a little better when visualized on mobiles or tablets. To preview how our tour would be seen on a phone, we can either publish the tour and actually open it on our smartphone, or we can use a very handy little tool that Google Chrome, so our browser, offers, and which lets us simulate how our window would be seen on a mobile device. To do that, we press F12 and we'll see a control panel which, well, looks pretty scary at first because it mainly contains tools for developers. But what I am about to show you is super easy and saves you a lot of time compared to always publishing and opening the tour on your actual mobile phone to check your layout. Simply click on this icon up here and this is how it would look on a mobile phone in horizontal. You could even simulate different phones by selecting from this drop-down menu. This might not be 100% correct and real, but it does give you an idea of how it would look. It is not 100% what you will see on your selected phone because we technically still have a browser bar, which we do not see here. But imagine you'd click full screen in the tour, then you would actually see it as it is here. Either way, it's an approximation and just a nice help to see how your layout would show on mobile phones and tablets. So we see that in horizontal our layout shows beautifully on a mobile phone screen too, because the horizontal mobile screen has similar dimensions to a normal desktop screen, which is where we designed this thing on. The interesting part now is switching to the vertical mobile screen, so simulating your users hold their mobile or tablet in vertical, which more often than not users will do. Actually, more and more people only work on a vertical mobile screen, so it is quite important that our window also work in this format. There are obviously some window layouts or designs where it might be harder to have the window also work in vertical than compared to other designs. So already when creating your window, you can decide if you prefer to design a window that perfectly fits to a horizontal screen with everything super defined and kind of compromise the vertical display option, or if you want to create, let's say, an intermediate solution that would work in both vertical and horizontal but might not be as perfectly fitted to either. Or if you want to block horizontal display options altogether. That's all up to you and really depends on what you need for your audience. But in our case here, without changing too much of the design, let's see how we can make this window work better with just some touches, so we can at least see or read the text here better. Okay, therefore the first thing we want to do is try and minimize these margins here. As you can see, in vertical they are just too big, which takes away valuable space for the window and which therefore also keeps the individual elements inside of the window, so the text, the image and even the button, too small. So let's go to the program. Now the problem here is that if we reduce the lateral margins here so that it looks better in vertical, then in the horizontal screen we would see these margins very, very small. But we can apply a little trick here so that in vertical these margins shrink, but in horizontal they remain more or less as they are. Therefore, we select our container 2 and we change these margins, which are defined by the position of each side of the window. But before that, we will limit the maximum size. These are the values that I worked out for my tours. What we do by this is, even though the margins can reduce, which makes the window potentially grow a lot, these maximum size values limit the amount by which the window can grow. So now we can change the margins. Let's say to 5. So the margins shrink or the window grows. And here in the skin editor, the screen now starts to not show exactly how it would look later. Therefore, we click on preview to see it. And see, the screen seems to be as it was before we changed the parameters, because even though we reduced this margin here quite a bit from 16 to 5, the window cannot grow further as we limited the size from here to a certain number of pixels, which apparently have been reached here, so that the window will not continue to grow further and the margins are being kept big. Now in turn, if we switch to the mobile format, you can see that the margins here are indeed smaller and the elements inside are a little bit bigger and better to visualize. Still, with this particular layout, we can go even further and improve it even more in mobile format. The important thing here is that you will be able to read the text on a mobile screen. Therefore, what we will force the window to do is, remember how we have two containers here. This is the one container and this here is the other one. Now we will leave the left container with its variable size, so in percentage, but for the right container we will set a minimum size to enforce that this area will always remain bigger while the other container here on the left continues to shrink. In this particular design, we think that this is the best way to go because it is more important to have the text readable, even though we have to slightly compromise the image visibility. So back to the program, and we will look for the right container with the text here, and we will give it a minimum size of, say, 400 pixels. This way we enforce that this container will always remain this size at least, which is big enough to be able to read the text. Since in the left container we don't have a minimum size and it's set to a percentage size, it can potentially become much smaller because the other is forced to remain big if we continue to minimize the overall screen. Let's have a look in the preview then. Okay, perfect. In horizontal it is still as it was, so that's good. And switching to mobile screen, see, we won a lot of space here for the text. It's much bigger than before. The image got a lot smaller because it is in percentage, yes, but the text side, as it now has a minimum size of 400 pixels, we at least made sure that you can read the text no matter how narrow the overall window is. Plus, the overall window also looks slightly better in terms of composition and layout. Overall, it comes back to looking for the best proportion between visualizing it well in horizontal and still being able to have the vertical format work as good as possible. There are designs that work perfectly fine in both formats, and then there are others where it gets more tricky and where you have to play around with some ideas like the ones we just showed, which can be quite useful in order to find a middle path and make both formats work without compromising either of them too much. In very extreme cases, where we consider it impossible to make the skin or windows work both in desktop and mobile, we always have the option to duplicate the tour and create two skins, or rather two tours. One with a skin that works perfectly for horizontal or desktop, and the other tour where we change the design of our interface and we adapt it exclusively to make it work perfectly on mobile devices and in vertical. We are currently working on the software to make it do this automatically, so you'd only create one single tour where you have the option to create one skin specifically for desktop and another specifically for mobile, both inside the same tool, so without the need to duplicate the project. So that is going to be available in the future. In the meantime, this is how you can work your way around this, and remember, the trick is to always preview the tour in both formats, for desktop and for mobile, if you anticipate your audience might see the tour on both devices. Thanks for watching.